What do you think about the idea of Texas as a swing state?
You're not considered one of the battleground states, although that's going to be changing soon.
President Obama speaking to a very enthusiastic crowd in the great state of Texas yesterday. If you are a Republican, the idea of Texas as a swing state is probably a very worrying idea. But look, Texas has now officially become a majority-minority state as of the last census, with Latinos leading that new majority group in Texas. And if you are a Republican politician, the view from the top of the ticket on the subject of your appeal to Latino voters is not a good view. In the latest Latino Decisions poll, which was just released today, President Obama's lead over Mitt Romney among Latino voters is 48 points. Not that he's got support of 48% of Latinos. 48 points is the margin of President Obama's lead. This is a big Republican problem. So what is the Republican Party doing about its horrible polling with the fastest-growing minority group in the country?
Soy Craig Romney. Quiero decirles cómo piensa mi padre Mitt Romney. Él valora mucho.
Well, there is this new ad airing in a handful of states featuring a handsome Romney offspring speaking in Spanish about the family's Mexican roots. Last week, we reported that the Romney campaign was spending just $10,000 on that ad buy in order to actually get it on the air. Today, the Washington Post reports that the Romney campaign is upping the ante. They are now spending almost $250,000 to put the one of Mitt Romney's sons speaks Spanish ad on the air. So there's that. They're doing that. $250,000 worth of Spanish-speaking Romney progeny. Is that going to be enough to close the 48-point gap between Mitt Romney and President Obama? Well, there's always Plan B. The Republicans have something else working in their favor this election year that may stand to help them with their staggering shortfall among minority voters. They have Republican governors and state legislatures in the states working to make it harder for minority populations to vote. Doesn't matter how many of them there are or what they think if they're not allowed to participate in the election, right? Since the big Republican sweep of 2010, 11 Republican-dominated states passed new laws requiring voters to present specific new documentation in order to be allowed to vote. Documentation you never had to show before and that not everyone has. And the people who don't have that documentation are disproportionately minorities. The Brennan Center for Justice, a nonpartisan public policy research group that studies voting rights, reports that as many as 11% of eligible voters do not have the kind of documentation that these new laws are now demanding you have to show before you get allowed to vote. That 11% is even higher among seniors, among low-income voters, among students, and yes, among minority voters. Today, the Brennan Center is out with a new study of the nation's strictest new make-it-harder-to-vote laws, and what those laws might mean for all those millions of eligible voters who don't have the documentation that these states now demand. In order to get away with putting a new legal barrier between you and your right to vote, these states are supposed to help voters get free photo IDs that they can show at the polling place so they'll be allowed to vote. They're supposed to be free because if you have to pay for a document that you suddenly need in order to vote, you're essentially being asked to pay a poll tax. You're being charged a fee in order to vote. And in America, that is unconstitutional. But according to the Brennan Center's report today, quote, this promise of free voter ID is a mirage. In the real world, poor voters find shuttered offices, long drives without cars, and with spotty or no bus service, and sometimes prohibitive costs. The Brennan Center's study focused on these 10 states, which have the strictest voter ID laws in the country. 8 of them are brand new laws enacted by Republicans after the 2010 midterms. But in these 10 states with strict photo ID laws for voting, in this new report, the Brennan Center says 1.2 million eligible African-American voters and 500,000 eligible Hispanic voters live more than 10 miles from the nearest state ID issuing office. Nearly 500,000 eligible voters do not have access to a vehicle and live more than 10 miles from the nearest state ID issuing office. More than 1 million voters in these states live below the federal poverty line and live more than 10 miles from the nearest state ID issuing office. And even if the thing they now need to show in order to vote is free, in order to get that thing, in order to get the, quote, free state ID, people often have to pay for the government documents like birth certificates or marriage licenses or whatever, the things that you need to show in order to get what they are calling this free thing. Right now, the Republican candidate, Mitt Romney, is losing Latino voters to President Obama by nearly 50 points. He is losing African-American voters to President Obama by 90 points. But if millions of those voters are not allowed to cast ballots on Election Day, the margin could well be 100 points. No one will be counting when it counts. Joining us now is Michael Waldman. He's president of the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law. Mr. Waldman, it's good to see you. Thanks for being here.
My pleasure.
Let me ask first if I misstated anything from your report or if I got any of that wrong.
Sadly, you got it right. The facts are pretty clear that despite the promise and even the constitutional requirement of making this ID available to everybody, in reality, it is going to be very hard to get to the place where you get the ID, to get the documents for a lot of our fellow citizens, and that really runs counter to, to the basic premise of American democracy, to the idea that we're all created equal, going back hundreds of years. It's going to be a real challenge to that.
In terms of legal challenges to these new legal barriers to voting, is it the sort of thing where you just have to, on paper, say the IDs are free, but it doesn't really matter if nobody can access them? Have the courts tended to look on issues like this as something where you just have to get it right on paper and it doesn't really matter how it works in practice? Or is the scrutiny of how it actually works in the real world, whether there is a real world effect on disenfranchising people?
Well, it's a great question. The reality is a lot of these laws are so new that we don't know how the courts are going to rule on that kind of question of the reality of it. But the fact is, in 2011, as you said, many states, as soon as the Republicans got a pinky on a lever of power in these state legislatures, they rushed through laws to cut back on the ability to vote. That was last year. What's interesting is this year, a lot of those same laws have hit a wall of opposition from the courts and from the voters, so that you had just today in Wisconsin, a judge blocked the voter ID law there. You've had the Justice Department saying that the Texas law and the South Carolina law violate the Voting Rights Act. And all over the country, you're seeing real resistance to it, but there are some places like Pennsylvania where the Voting Rights Act isn't as relevant, and we don't know how that's going to play out.
In terms of the real-world impact of these disenfranchising laws, at this point, time is short and the river's rising. I mean, whether or not these things are in the long term going to be upheld constitutionally, whether or not they're susceptible to litigation or to other more oblique forms of political resistance in the long term, the real question is what's going to happen in time for the November election. How do you think these things are going to be resolved, especially in these swing states where these are potentially going to be newly in place for the first time for November?
Well, it's a scary prospect. I mean, all of us should be doing everything we can to make sure that people get the ID they need as much as possible, to let people know that even if these obstacles are there, they can still vote. There have been barriers placed in their way, but in a way that makes it even more important that people take the responsibility to go that extra distance. And in some places, it's going to be kind of hand-to-hand combat in the courts all the way up till Election Day, because you get local officials purging people from the rolls. You have people challenging voters at the polling place. And unfortunately, we're going to see this kind of thing play out all across the country for the rest of the year.
In political science terms, we know that it is at least believed by political practitioners that a smaller electorate benefits conservative candidates, benefits Republican candidates, and that is what explains the Republican motivation to try to shrink the electorate by excluding voters, particularly when they can target exclusions in a way that are going to affect people who are most likely to vote Democratic. Is there, from your perspective, studying these things nationally, is there any connection between the types of barriers that are being put between voters and their right to vote and any legitimate effort to combat voter fraud? That's the Republican line on this. We're just trying to keep the vote fair. There's too much fraud, and this will stop fraud. If fraud were as big a problem as they say it is, are these the kinds of laws that would stop it?
Well, look, the only kind of fraud that would be stopped by this kind of very narrow voter ID requirement, which is basically saying that you need a driver's license or some particular kind of paperwork that 1 out of 10 eligible voters don't have. The only kind of misconduct that stops is impersonating another person, walking in and saying you're someone else. But there are many, many ways in which our election system is a mess. Our voter registration system is ramshackle. It's from the last century. And we could find ways to improve that should be acceptable to people from all political points of view. If we modernized our voter registration system, used computer technology to say, you know what, from now on the government's going to keep the list and everybody who's eligible to vote is on the list permanently, that would add up to 65 million people to the rolls. It would cost less. And for people who are really worried about fraud, it would solve that problem too. It would curb that potential. We could move past these partisan voting wars if we wanted to, but what we're seeing right now is a kind of a classic case where politicians are manipulating the rules to benefit themselves. And we look back at Tammany Hall or these other things in the past, and we think, why did people put up with that stuff? And unfortunately, that impulse by people in power to preserve their power by manipulating the rules knows no boundaries of time or party. I mean, this is just right now we're seeing it with the Republicans, but we can do a lot better all across the country in a nonpartisan or bipartisan way.
Yeah, but then more people might vote. We can't have that. Michael Waldman, president of the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law. What the Brennan Center does, not just in terms of explaining this stuff, but actually providing the hard data so that everybody can say about it, whatever it is we all have to say about it, is really a great public service to the country. So thank you for what you do at the Brennan Center. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
I appreciate it. All right, Department of Corrections, special Batman and Rush Limbaugh edition coming up. Sorry.